He dove into the depths of the Red Sea, expecting to find ancient ruins. But what he heard down there shattered everything he believed about reality. A proud atheist, a man of science, suddenly confronted with voices that couldn't possibly exist. This is the unbelievable story of how a British diver met faith where no human voice should be heard. His name was Marcus Thompson, and he was everything you might expect from a man who had turned his back on God. Born in the coastal town of Brighton, England, Marcus grew up in a household where religion was not just ignored, it was actively mocked. His father, a marine biologist, would often ridicule the local churchgoers, calling them deluded fools clinging to ancient superstitions. His mother, a university professor, taught him that science had all the answers, and that faith was simply a crutch for the weak-minded. By the age of 12, Marcus had already decided that God was nothing more than a fairy tale, invented by primitive people who couldn't understand the natural world. He excelled in school, particularly in marine biology and physics, and by 18, he had earned his professional diving certification with the highest honors. His instructors praised his natural ability underwater. He seemed to move through the depths with an almost supernatural grace, as if the ocean itself welcomed him. Marcus specialized in deep-sea exploration and underwater archaeology. By his 30s, he had explored shipwrecks off the coast of Ireland, documented ancient ruins in the Mediterranean, and worked with major television networks on underwater documentaries. He was fearless, methodical, and completely confident in his abilities. The ocean was his domain, and he ruled it with scientific precision and technological mastery. But there was a darkness in Marcus that went beyond his atheism. He was consumed by pride. Pride in his achievements, pride in his intellect, pride in his ability to conquer the depths that terrified most people. He looked down on believers with contempt, seeing them as intellectually inferior. He would often joke with his diving colleagues about sky fairies and imaginary friends, and took particular pleasure in debating religious people, using his scientific knowledge to tear apart their beliefs. Marcus lived alone in a modern apartment overlooking the English Channel. He had never married, claiming that relationships were just biological imperatives that intelligent people should rise above. His only companions were his diving equipment and his books on marine science. He spent his evenings reading research papers and planning his next expedition, convinced that he was living the only rational life possible. On weekends, he would dive alone off the British coast, exploring underwater caves and documenting marine life. These solo dives were his meditation, his escape from what he saw as the ignorance and superstition of the world above. In the silent depths, surrounded by the blue-green light filtering down from the surface, Marcus felt truly alive. Here, he believed, was the real cathedral, not some man-made building filled with deluded worshippers, but the vast underwater world that operated according to the pure laws of physics and biology. Marcus was particularly dismissive of Islam, which he saw as the most backward of all religions. He would often rant about how Islamic countries were stuck in the medieval period, how the religion oppressed women and stifled scientific progress. He had no understanding of Islamic contributions to science, no knowledge of the golden age of Islamic civilization. In his mind, Islam was synonymous with ignorance and violence, and Muslims were people who had simply failed to embrace the Enlightenment that had freed Western civilization from religious delusion. This was the man, proud, arrogant, contemptuous of faith, who received an email that would change everything. The message came from the Maritime Archaeological Institute, offering him a position on a 6-month expedition to explore ancient trade routes in the Red Sea. The project would involve diving to depths of over 200 feet, documenting underwater ruins that dated back thousands of years. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Marcus lived for. The expedition was based out of Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and Marcus arrived there on a scorching hot day in July. The heat hit him like a physical blow as he stepped off the plane, but he was excited. This was his chance to make discoveries that would cement his reputation as one of the world's leading underwater archaeologists. He had no interest in the culture or people of Egypt. They were simply the backdrop for his scientific work. The diving team consisted of 12 specialists from various countries. Marcus quickly established himself as the unofficial leader, his years of experience and natural confidence making the others defer to his judgment. They spent the first week conducting shallow dives, mapping the seafloor, and identifying potential sites for deeper exploration. Marcus was in his element. The Red Sea was unlike anything he had experienced before. The water was so clear, it seemed like diving through liquid crystal, and the marine life was more diverse and colorful than anything he had seen in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. But he approached it all with the same clinical detachment he brought to every dive. This was just another underwater environment to be cataloged and understood. The team's first major dive was to a site called the Temple of Poseidon, where ancient Greek traders had allegedly built an underwater shrine to ensure safe passage through the dangerous waters of the Red Sea. The ruins lay at a depth of 180 feet, right at the edge of safe diving limits. Marcus would be going down alone, as was his preference for the most challenging dives. As he descended through the crystal clear water, Marcus felt the familiar sense of peace that came with depth. The surface world, with all its noise and chaos, faded away, replaced by the profound silence of the deep. At 100 feet, he paused to equalize the pressure in his ears and check his equipment. Everything was perfect. His breathing was steady, his buoyancy was neutral, and he had plenty of air remaining. At 150 feet, the ancient ruins came into view. Massive stone blocks covered in coral and sea growth stretched across the seafloor, forming what had once been a magnificent temple. Marcus felt a thrill of discovery as he began to document the site with his underwater camera. This was what he lived for, the moment when human history revealed itself to his trained eye. He spent 40 minutes exploring the ruins, carefully photographing the carved reliefs and measuring the dimensions of the structure. The workmanship was extraordinary. Whoever had built this temple had been master craftsmen, able to create beauty that had endured for millennia beneath the waves. Marcus found himself genuinely moved by the artistry, though he attributed this emotion to nothing more than appreciation for human achievement. It was as he prepared to begin his ascent that it happened. Marcus was adjusting his camera equipment when he suddenly became aware of a sound that should have been impossible at this depth. It was human voices, multiple voices, singing or chanting in unison. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the water with a clarity that defied explanation. Marcus froze, his heart rate spiking as he tried to process what he was hearing. There was no one else in the water. He had descended alone, and his dive computer showed no other divers in the area. The sound was beautiful beyond description, unlike anything he had ever heard. It was rhythmic and melodic, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to speak directly to something deep within his chest. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he was experiencing nitrogen narcosis, the euphoric state that can affect divers at extreme depths. But his depth gauge showed only 180 feet, well within his experience range, and his thinking was perfectly clear. The voices continued, growing stronger and more distinct. He could make out individual words now, though they were in a language he didn't recognize. The melody was haunting, filled with a longing and reverence that made his eyes water behind his diving mask. Marcus spun around, searching desperately for the source of the voices. The ancient temple ruins stretched out before him, covered in coral and inhabited only by fish. There was no possible source for human voices at this depth, yet he could hear them as clearly as if he were standing in a concert hall. The chanting seemed to be coming from the temple itself, as if the ancient stones were somehow singing. The sound began to fade, growing softer until it was barely audible, then disappearing entirely. Marcus hung motionless in the water, his mind reeling. What had he just experienced? As a man of science, he searched for rational explanations. Perhaps it was some kind of acoustic phenomenon, sound waves traveling through the water from a distant source, but that made no sense given the clarity and proximity of the voices. He completed his ascent in a daze, following all the proper decompression procedures automatically, while his mind struggled to process what had happened. When he finally broke the surface, the bright sunlight and the chatter of his colleagues seemed almost surreal after the profound experience in the depths. "How did it go down there?" asked Dr. Sarah Chen, the expedition's marine archaeologist. Marcus hesitated, then forced a smile. "Incredible sight. The ruins are in much better condition than we expected. I got some excellent footage." He said nothing about the voices. How could he? As a respected scientist, admitting to hearing impossible sounds underwater would destroy his credibility. His colleagues would assume he had been affected by nitrogen narcosis or was suffering from some form of psychological breakdown. Marcus had spent his entire career building a reputation based on rational, scientific observation. He couldn't risk that reputation on something he couldn't explain. But that night, alone in his hotel room, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of what he had heard. The voices had been so beautiful, so filled with emotion and meaning. He found himself trying to recreate the melody in his mind, humming fragments of the haunting tune. There had been something about those voices that had touched a part of him he didn't even know existed, a part that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten it was there. Marcus tried to rationalize the experience. Perhaps it had been a hallucination brought on by the stress of the deep dive. Perhaps it was his subconscious mind creating meaning where none existed, responding to the awe-inspiring sight of the ancient temple. But even as he went through these logical explanations, he knew they didn't ring true. What he had experienced had been real as anything he had ever encountered in his life. Sleep eluded him that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard those voices again, calling to him from the depths. They seemed to be singing about something profound and eternal, something that existed beyond the physical world he understood so well. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself questioning the certainty of his materialist worldview. The next morning brought another dive, this time to a different section of the temple complex. Marcus descended with the same methodical precision he always employed, but his heart was racing with anticipation. Would he hear the voices again? Part of him hoped he would, while another part feared what it might mean for his sanity. The second dive yielded more archaeological treasures: intact pottery, carved statues, even what appeared to be ancient scrolls preserved in sealed containers. Marcus documented everything with his usual thoroughness, but his ears were straining for any hint of the mysterious chanting. The dive passed without incident, leaving him feeling both relieved and strangely disappointed. It was on the third dive that Marcus had an experience that would shatter his understanding of reality completely. He was exploring a narrow passage between two massive stone blocks when his air supply suddenly failed. The regulator that delivered breathing gas from his tank to his lungs simply stopped working, leaving him stranded at 160 feet with no way to breathe. Marcus had trained for this exact scenario countless times. He had a backup regulator, emergency air supplies, and decades of experience managing underwater crises. But as he reached for his emergency equipment, he realized with growing horror that he was trapped. The passage had narrowed unexpectedly, and his diving gear was caught on the ancient stonework. He was wedged between the temple blocks, unable to move forward or backward, with no air to breathe. Panic began to set in as Marcus struggled against the unyielding stone. His emergency air supply was out of reach, pinned beneath his trapped body. He had perhaps 30 seconds of air remaining in his lungs before he would be forced to inhale seawater. This was exactly how divers died, alone, trapped, and forgotten in the depths. As the seconds ticked by, Marcus felt his oxygen-starved brain beginning to shut down. His vision tunneled, and a strange calmness settled over him. He was going to die here, in this ancient temple, 200 feet from the surface in any hope of rescue. His pride, his atheism, his scientific achievements, none of it mattered now. He was just another human being, fragile and mortal, facing the inevitable end that awaited all living things. And then, in that moment of ultimate helplessness, the voices returned. They came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding Marcus with their ethereal beauty. But this time, the chanting was different. Instead of the haunting melody he had heard before, the voices were reciting something that sounded like a prayer or invocation. The words were still in a language he didn't understand, but their meaning somehow penetrated directly into his consciousness. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. The words echoed through the water with impossible clarity. Marcus didn't know what they meant, but he could feel their power. The voices were not just reciting these words. They were proclaiming them with absolute conviction and joy. As the chanting continued, Marcus felt a strange peace descend upon him. The panic that had gripped him moments before melted away, replaced by a profound sense of being held and protected. And then something impossible happened. The stone blocks that had trapped Marcus began to shift. Not slowly, as if dislodged by current or seismic activity, but deliberately, as if being moved by invisible hands. The passage that had been too narrow for him to escape suddenly widened, freeing his trapped equipment and allowing him to reach his emergency air supply. Marcus gasped as the life-giving air filled his lungs. He was free, alive, and completely bewildered by what had just occurred. The massive stone blocks that had shifted to save his life now looked exactly as they had before. Ancient, weathered, and immovable. There was no sign that they had ever moved at all. As he began his emergency ascent to the surface, Marcus could still hear the voices chanting those mysterious words. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. The sound followed him upward through the water, growing fainter as he rose, but never completely disappearing. Even as he broke the surface and was hauled aboard the dive boat by his worried colleagues, he could still hear the echo of that chanting in his mind. The dive team's medic checked Marcus thoroughly, but found no signs of decompression sickness or other diving-related injuries. To everyone else, it appeared that he had simply had a close call with a malfunctioning regulator, the kind of equipment failure that every experienced diver encounters eventually. Marcus went along with this explanation, describing how he had managed to free himself and reach his backup air supply. But privately, Marcus knew that what had happened to him defied all rational explanation. The stone blocks had moved to save his life. He was certain of that. And the voices that had surrounded him in his moment of crisis had been more real than anything he had ever experienced. They had spoken to him in a language he didn't understand, yet their message had been crystal clear. He was not alone, and he was being watched over by something infinitely greater than himself. That night, Marcus sat on the balcony of his hotel room, staring out at the Red Sea. The water that had nearly been his grave now sparkled peacefully under the starlight. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself considering the possibility that his atheistic worldview might be incomplete. The voices he had heard, the impossible movement of those massive stones, these experiences had shaken the very foundations of his materialist philosophy. Marcus had always prided himself on being a rational person who followed the evidence wherever it led. Now he was faced with evidence that seemed to point towards something beyond the physical world he understood. The voices had been real. He was certain of that. But if they were real, what did that mean? Who or what had been chanting those mysterious words in the depths of the Red Sea? Unable to sleep, Marcus decided to do what he had always done when faced with a mystery: research. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about the words he had heard. It took him several attempts to find the right spelling, but eventually he discovered that La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah were Arabic words meaning there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Marcus stared at the screen in shock. These were Islamic words, the Shahada, the declaration of faith that every Muslim recites. But how was that possible? He had heard these words in the depths of the Red Sea, chanted by voices that had no earthly source. Was it possible that somehow, in his moment of crisis, he had been reached by something connected to Islam? Marcus began to read about Islam with the same methodical approach he brought to his archaeological research. He learned about the Prophet Muhammad, about the Quran, about the 5 pillars of faith. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the religion he had spent so many years mocking and dismissing. Islam, he learned, was not the backward, anti-scientific religion he had imagined. The Quran contained verses that seemed to describe natural phenomena with startling accuracy. The water cycle, embryonic development, the expansion of the universe. Many of the greatest scientists in history had been Muslims, making discoveries that laid the foundation for modern science during the Islamic Golden Age. As Marcus read late into the night, he came across a verse from the Quran that made him gasp. And it is He who sends down rain from heaven, and we produce thereby the vegetation of every kind. We produce from it greenery, from which we produce grain arranged in layers. And from the palm trees, of its emerging fruit are clusters hanging low. And gardens of grapevines and olives and pomegranates, similar yet varied. Look at their fruit when it emerges and when it ripens. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who believe. The verse was describing the natural world in terms that Marcus, as a marine biologist, could appreciate. But more than that, it was calling on people to see the signs of a creator in the complexity and beauty of nature. Marcus thought about the incredible diversity of life he had witnessed in the Red Sea, the perfect engineering of coral reefs, the elegant adaptations that allowed creatures to thrive in the harsh environment of the deep ocean. For the first time, Marcus began to consider the possibility that this complexity might not be the result of blind chance and natural selection alone. Perhaps there was an intelligence behind it all, a designer who had created the natural world with purpose and meaning. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating to someone who had spent his entire life believing that the universe was nothing more than matter in motion. Over the following days, Marcus continued his research into Islam while maintaining his normal diving schedule. He learned about the Prophet Muhammad's character, his emphasis on knowledge and learning, his respect for other faiths. He read about the Islamic concept of Tawheed, the oneness of God, and found it intellectually compelling in a way that the Christian Trinity had never been. But it was the story of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the Isra and Miraj, that truly captured Marcus's imagination. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet had been transported from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascended through the heavens to meet with God. The story was filled with miraculous elements that the rational part of Marcus's mind wanted to dismiss as mythology. Yet as he read the account, Marcus couldn't help but think of his own impossible experience in the depths of the Red Sea. If he could hear voices chanting Islamic prayers at the bottom of the ocean, if massive stone blocks could move to save his life, then perhaps miracles were not as impossible as he had always believed. Marcus began to notice changes in himself that went beyond intellectual curiosity. The arrogance and contempt that had characterized his interactions with the religious people began to fade, replaced by growing humility. He found himself looking at his Egyptian colleagues with new eyes, seeing them not as backward adherents to primitive superstitions, but as people who might possess wisdom that he had been too proud to recognize. One evening, as the call to prayer echoed across Sharm el-Sheikh, Marcus found himself listening with genuine attention instead of dismissive irritation. The Arabic words were hauntingly beautiful, and he realized with a start that the melody was similar to the chanting he had heard underwater. His heart began to race as the implications hit him. Could it be possible that what he had experienced in the depths was somehow connected to the Islamic call to prayer? Marcus decided to visit a local mosque to learn more. He had never set foot in a religious building as an adult, and he felt nervous as he approached the simple white structure with its distinctive minaret. The evening prayer had just concluded, and worshippers were emerging into the warm night air. Most ignored the obviously foreign visitor, but an elderly man with a kind face approached Marcus and greeted him in broken English. "Welcome, my friend. You are visitor to our mosque?" Marcus nodded, suddenly tongue-tied. I was curious about Islam. I've been reading about your religion." The man's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "This is wonderful. You are always welcome here. My name is Ahmed. I am Imam, leader of prayers here." Ahmed invited Marcus to sit with him in the mosque's courtyard, and they began a conversation that would continue for hours. Marcus found himself opening up to this stranger in a way he had never done with anyone. He told Ahmed about his diving career, his atheistic background, and finally, hesitantly, about his experience in the depths of the Red Sea. Ahmed listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions. When Marcus finished his story, the Imam was quiet for a long moment. "My friend," Ahmed finally said, "what you have experienced is a great blessing. Allah, God, sometimes calls to people in ways they do not expect. The verses you heard, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulallah, these are the words that Muslims say when they accept Islam. Perhaps Allah was preparing your heart." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, the first tears he had shed since childhood. "But I don't understand. I've spent my whole life rejecting God. Why would He reach out to someone like me?" Ahmed smiled gently. "Allah's mercy is infinite, my friend. The Quran tells us that He guides whom He wills, and sometimes He guides those who seem furthest from the path. Your experience in the sea, this was not accident, this was invitation." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked along the shore of the Red Sea, the same waters that had nearly claimed his life, and had somehow led him toward a faith he had never imagined embracing. The waves lapped gently at his feet as he considered the impossible journey that had brought him to this moment. Everything he had believed about himself, about reality, about the nature of existence was being challenged. Marcus had always prided himself on being a man of science, someone who followed evidence and logic. But what did you do when the evidence pointed towards something beyond the natural world? What did you do when logic itself seemed to suggest the existence of a divine intelligence? As he stood there on the beach, Marcus heard the call to prayer echoing from the mosque in the distance. The Arabic words that had once seemed meaningless to him now carried profound significance. He understood now that what he had heard in the depths of the Red Sea had been more than just mysterious voices. It had been a call to faith, an invitation to discover a truth that he had spent his entire life running from. Marcus thought about his life up to this point, the loneliness, the pride, the emptiness that he had filled with professional achievements and scientific knowledge. He had been successful by every measure that mattered to him, yet he had never felt truly fulfilled. There had always been something missing, a void that no amount of recognition or discovery could fill. Now, for the first time, Marcus began to understand what that missing piece might be. The voices in the sea had not just saved his life. They had awakened something in his soul that had been dormant for decades. He felt a longing for something greater than himself, a desire to be part of something meaningful and eternal. The next few days passed in a blur of research, reflection, and conversation with Ahmed. Marcus devoured everything he could find about Islam, its history, its teachings, its spiritual practices. He was amazed to discover how much he had misunderstood about the religion. Far from being anti-intellectual, Islam encouraged the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. The Quran contained numerous verses praising those who reflected on the natural world and sought to understand God's creation. Marcus began to see his own work as a marine biologist in a new light. Instead of simply cataloging the diversity of ocean life, he began to appreciate the incredible complexity and beauty of the underwater world as signs of divine creativity. The intricate relationships between species, the perfect balance of marine ecosystems, the stunning adaptations that allowed life to flourish in the most challenging environments, all of this pointed toward an intelligence far greater than random chance. But it was during his final dive at the Temple of Poseidon's site that Marcus had the experience that would finally convince him to embrace Islam. He had descended to the ruins one last time to complete his documentation of the archaeological site. As he worked among the ancient stones, photographing hieroglyphs and measuring structures, he found himself thinking about the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. It was then that the voices returned for the third and final time. But now, instead of the mysterious chanting he had heard before, Marcus could clearly understand what was being said. The voices were reciting verses from the Quran in Arabic, but somehow he could comprehend their meaning. And it is He who created the heavens and earth in truth. And the day He says, "Be." And it is, His word is the truth. And His is the dominion on the day the horn is blown. He is knower of the unseen and the witnessed, and He is the wise, the acquainted. The words filled Marcus with a sense of awe and recognition. This was the truth he had been searching for without even knowing it. The explanation for the order and beauty he had witnessed throughout his career exploring the natural world. The voices continued, reciting verses about the signs of God in creation, the importance of seeking knowledge, and the mercy available to all who turn to their Creator. As the voices faded, Marcus knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. The evidence was overwhelming, not just the miraculous experiences he had witnessed, but the intellectual and spiritual truth of Islam itself. He had been called to faith in the most unlikely way imaginable, and he would not turn away from that calling. Marcus completed his ascent and returned to the dive boat for the last time. That evening, he met with Ahmed at the mosque and made his decision official. In front of a small gathering of local Muslims, Marcus recited the Shahada, the same words he had heard chanted in the depths of the Red Sea. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His messenger. As the words left his lips, Marcus felt a transformation unlike anything he had ever experienced. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long was suddenly filled with purpose and meaning. The pride and arrogance that had defined his personality melted away, replaced by humility and gratitude. He was no longer Marcus Thompson, the atheist marine biologist. He was now Abdullah, a servant of Allah who had found his way home through the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. The news of Marcus's conversion spread quickly through the diving community. Some of his colleagues were shocked, others were skeptical, and a few were openly hostile. His family back in England was devastated, unable to understand how their rational, scientific son could have embraced what they saw as primitive religious fanaticism. But Marcus, now Abdullah, was at peace with their reactions. He understood their confusion because he had once shared their prejudices against Islam. He began to speak openly about his experiences, not to convince others but to share the truth of what had happened to him. He wrote articles for diving magazines about his conversion, appeared on television programs, and gave lectures at universities about the intersection of science and faith. Abdullah's approach to his work changed dramatically after his conversion to Islam. While he remained just as rigorous in his scientific methodology, he now saw his research as a form of worship, a way of appreciating and understanding the signs of Allah in creation. He began each dive with a prayer, asking for guidance and protection, and he ended each expedition with gratitude for the wonders he had been privileged to witness. The underwater world that had once been simply a subject for scientific study became a cathedral where Abdullah felt closest to his Creator. Every coral reef was a masterpiece of divine artistry. Every school of fish a demonstration of perfect coordination and design. The same depths that had nearly claimed his life became places of spiritual reflection and connection with the divine. Abdullah also began to study Arabic so that he could read the Quran in its original language. He was amazed to discover that the verses he had heard, chanted in the depths of the Red Sea, were among the most beautiful and profound in the entire Holy Book. The experience of hearing these words underwater, before he even knew they existed, convinced him beyond any doubt that his conversion was not the result of psychological suggestion or wishful thinking, but genuine divine guidance. Years later, Abdullah would establish a marine conservation organization based on Islamic principles of stewardship and environmental protection. He traveled the world speaking about the compatibility of science and faith, showing audiences how the study of the natural world could deepen rather than diminish religious belief. His work helped to bridge the gap between religious and secular communities, demonstrating that faith and reason could work together in the pursuit of truth. But perhaps most importantly, Abdullah never forgot the miraculous circumstances of his conversion. He returned to the Red Sea many times over the years, diving at the same Temple of Poseidon site where he had first heard the impossible voices. Each time he descended to those ancient ruins, he offered prayers of gratitude for the mercy that had reached him in his darkest hour. The stone blocks that had mysteriously shifted to save his life remained exactly as they had been for millennia, immovable, weathered, and silent. But Abdullah knew that he had witnessed a miracle that day, a divine intervention that had saved not just his physical life, but his eternal soul. The voices that had chanted the Shahada in the depths of the ocean had been more than hallucinations or acoustic phenomena. They had been messengers of the Most High, calling a lost soul back to his Creator. Abdullah's story became legendary in both the diving and Muslim communities. It was told and retold as an example of how Allah's guidance could reach anyone, anywhere, in the most unexpected ways. For some, it was simply an inspiring tale of personal transformation. For others, it was proof that miracles still occurred in the modern world, that the divine had not abandoned humanity to struggle alone in the darkness. As Abdullah grew older, he often reflected on the journey that had brought him from the depths of atheism to the heights of faith. He had spent the first half of his life believing that the universe was nothing more than matter in motion, that consciousness was simply an accident of evolution, that death was the end of existence. The second half of his life had been devoted to understanding and serving the Creator who had revealed himself through the very creation that Abdullah had spent his career studying. The man who had once mocked believers as intellectually inferior now understood that true knowledge began with acknowledging the source of all knowledge. The scientist who had once seen religion as the enemy of reason now recognized that the deepest truths about existence could only be apprehended through a combination of empirical observation and spiritual insight. Abdullah's conversion had not diminished his love for the ocean. If anything, it had deepened it. Every dive was now a pilgrimage, every underwater expedition a journey into the cathedral of creation. The same waters that had witnessed his transformation continued to teach him about the infinite creativity and mercy of his Lord. In his final years, Abdullah would often tell young Muslims about the importance of maintaining their faith even in the face of scientific materialism. He would explain that the natural world, properly understood, was not evidence against the existence of God, but rather the most powerful testimony to His reality. The complexity of life, the fine-tuning of physical constants, the beauty and order that pervaded creation at every level. All of this pointed toward an intelligent designer who had created the universe with purpose and meaning. But Abdullah's most important message was about the infinite mercy of Allah. He would remind his audiences that no one was too far from guidance, no one too lost to be found. If someone like him, a proud atheist who had spent decades mocking faith, could be reached by divine mercy in the depths of the ocean, then anyone could be guided to the straight path. The story of Abdullah's conversion would be told for generations, inspiring countless others to examine their own beliefs and consider the possibility that there might be more to existence than they had previously imagined. It served as a reminder that in a world increasingly dominated by scientific materialism, the human heart still yearned for transcendence, for meaning, for connection with something greater than itself. And in the depths of the Red Sea, where an ancient temple still stands as a testament to humanity's eternal search for the divine, the memory of those impossible voices continues to echo. They call to other lost souls, other seekers, other hearts that are ready to hear the truth that can transform a life in an instant. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His messenger. This is the power of faith, the reality of divine guidance, and the promise that no matter how far we may wander from the path, we are never beyond the reach of infinite mercy. Abdullah's story is proof that Allah's call can reach us anywhere, even in the darkest depths of the ocean, even in the depths of our own despair and disbelief. May Allah guide us all to the straight path, and may we have the wisdom to recognize His signs when they appear in our lives, no matter how impossible they might seem. Ameen.